Writer and literary critic Dr. Wamuwi Mbao brought together 50 years of protest poetry in a single volume titled Years of Fire and Ash, South African Poems of Decolonisation. This book is a poetry collection that features some of the country's wordsmiths, from old voices to those who have just claimed their space in the literary landscape. And to help us unpack this offering that explores the central theme of decolonisation, Dr. Wamuwi Mbao joins us now via Zoom. Dr. Mbao, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning. Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Now, speak to us, if you can, about this book and what propelled you to put together these voices in one single volume to produce this collection.
So the book was motivated by a sense that we had a lot of very recent poetry on decolonization and, post-apartheid struggles in South Africa that was in danger of disappearing or fading from view because it hadn't been captured in an anthology. And so the motivation behind the collection was to kind of draw that newer poetry into conversation with a lot of the older poetry that some people might be more familiar with, to show that there's actually a very long lineage of poetry around ideas of decolonization and social and political struggle in South Africa, and to draw them into conversation with one another in an interesting way.
Now, Dr. Mbao, let's talk about the significance of the title Years of Fire and Ash.
Mm-hmm. The title comes, or it's drawn from a poem, or one of the poems in the collection, called 1976 by Opa Tando Mtunkulu. Mm-hmm. It's the closing line of this very incendiary poem. And I think that poem is one of the anchors of the collection because it speaks to how the memory of 1976 is this thing that burns in the collective consciousness and is something which we still struggle to come to terms with on a day-to-day basis in our own political lives.
I see this collection is divided into 4 parts, namely pre-Sharpeville, post-Sharpeville, post-Soweto, and present day. Now, briefly speak to us about the poems that are contained in these sections.
So each section was designed to kind of give a snapshot of a sort of timeline of struggle poetry over the ages in South Africa, to show that it is something that extends back beyond the Soweto poetry of the 1970s that many people are familiar with, and also something that extends forward into the present day. So the earliest sections, well, the early section deals with poetry where various poets are speaking to conditions that occur before Sharpeville in 1960. So conditions of working in the mines. There's a poem in there by Peter Abrams, for instance. And then we see poems that start to deal with the more direct political struggle of post-1960s, post-Sharpeville South Africa in different ways. And of course, the next section after 1976 shows us how poets were dealing with South Africa at the time of the state of emergency and the state of crisis, as apartheid was reaching its critical point. And the final section brings together most of what is contemporary about South African struggle poetry. So it looks at poetry from the years of the 2000s onwards to show that even though apartheid might have vanished from the scene, its structural legacy is still present, and it still informs a lot of the things that are going on today.
Yes. And the central theme, I suppose, then, is decolonization. So what does this term mean for you personally?
So decolonization, which is a very loaded term for a lot of people, refers to the sort of structural dismantling of the structural legacies and hangovers from the days of colonialism, from the days of apartheid, which is also a form of colonialism, and imperialism, that still wreak their effects in our day-to-day living, in our current day, in our current moment. So even though those things might have been structurally or politically dismantled, the after effects of those are still present, and this is why decolonization is necessary, because it has to occur in the physical or political structures of our day-to-day lives. So whether that be universities or other political structures that we interact with as people in South Africa or around the world, it's about the struggle for social justice and for allow everyone to have their place in the sun, as it were.
Now, this book features a long list of renowned poets and as well as new cats in the name of, poet laureate Manio Mohale. So how did you decide on the poems that you featured on this collection?
It was a very difficult decision. I mean, I think that with the very fruitful poetry scene that we have in South Africa, you could write and put together 30 different anthologies or a massive anthology, and it was really difficult to kind of pare it down to just a couple of voices. You always feel like you're leaving someone out. But I think the ultimate decision was informed by a sense of trying to connect with the people who are at the forefront of the current and contemporary poet movements, people who appear in the very dynamic open poetry scenes and performance poetry scenes, and to connect those to some of the older written poets, some of the people who have gone before, who have established poetry as a vital political force in this country.
There's a poem that I found very interesting and quite significant, especially in the month of June, by Opa Mtimkulu, titled 1976. So just take us through this piece.
So 1976, which I think, as I said, is the anchor poem of the collection, it's a very short and powerful poem. It goes, "Go, 1976. We need you no more. Never come again. We ache inside. Good friends we have lost. 1976, you stand accused of deaths, imprisonments, exiles, and detentions. You lost the battle. You were not revolutionary enough. We do not boast about you. Year of fire, year of ash."
Very thought-provoking, hey? And it gets us thinking. It gets us thinking about so many issues. And it gets us talking about not just 1976, but about, modern-day South Africa and where we are in terms of realizing, the vision that the youth of 1976 had for South Africa, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. I think it speaks to the fact that, the part of the legacy of 1976 is that much of that struggle, even though perhaps the direct political things might have been attained, much of that struggle is still to be realized, and in fact has taken on new forms in our current era.
All right, Dr. Mbao, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the viewers.
All right, thank you. Well, that was a writer and a literary critic, Dr. Wamuwi Mbao, and we were just in conversation with him about a poetry collection book that he had edited, and it's titled Years of Fire and Ash. This is Morning Live. Let's go for coffee.